We're certainly moving at a very rapid clip. The way that we are converging both the tech advancements of the last couple of decades with now the biotech and the molecular advancements is just crazy. It's an amazing time. It's an amazing time to be engaged with the world.
Hey, Karl, how's it going?
Good, Erum. How about you?
I'm doing well. I've been really busy, obviously, with work. You know that. There's work behind the screen, but then there's work going out there, meeting people. And in New York, it has been quite busy in the biotech space. Lots of events. Let's say there's open space labs, there's different accelerator programs that are having events trying to highlight what's going on the entrepreneurial space, what's going on the community level, what's going on the academic level. We have events that are being hosted by Weill Cornell, which has their biotech focused accelerator. So does Rockefeller University. We have our classics like IndieBio, Biolabs, Merck Digital Sciences Studio has one. The Cured, that's more of a space. It's like an office building. So there's different categories of organizations that are supporting the biotech community here in New York. Obviously, you've been seeing this for many years now, from the beginning where it started diverging just outside of biopharma here in New York City. So what events are you excited about? What organizations are really catching your attention?
Well, I haven't been to The Cure yet, to the Deerfield space on 3rd Avenue. A guy who I was on a panel on a couple of weeks ago, Stephen Reddy, now puts out a weekly summary of investor events on LinkedIn, which I think is worth looking at. But you could go to events all the time. It might sound like we do, but it's a good way to keep a pulse on what's going on.
What are you seeing more of? In the beginning, there was GenSpace, of course. They've been around for a while, and that's more of a community biotech lab. We're starting to see more entrepreneur programs. So accelerator programs, we're seeing universities getting on board behind that. And of course, commercial lab space. There's been a lot of activity there. We've seen West End Labs. You mentioned The Cure. Our friend Vishal from Annika is getting on board. He has a new space for his company, but since it's so big, he's inviting other entrepreneurs to come use their labs called Culture Colonies. So there's a lot going on, and we're very excited for people to come to New York City and participate in the biotech community here.
Yeah, and that's just scratching the surface because we did a panel a few weeks ago at what used to be the Tasty Building in West Harlem. There's a huge space coming on board in the Navy Yard. And then I was lucky enough to go to an event at Innovators in Long Island City. So yeah, there's a ton. I mean, we have yet to do an event either in Staten Island or in the Bronx, but I'm sure it's just a matter of time. And we know that New Jersey has just so many spaces and new spaces coming on board. So it's very exciting to be a part of the growing bioeconomy and this emerging community.
Yeah, especially in New York City, recognizing the growth of the bioindustrial space, which is really what we highlight here on the podcast. The idea that you can grow everything using biology, not just medications, not just pharmaceutical drugs, not just agriculture, which bioengineering and ag, that's been around for several decades. But we're talking about being able to make collagen using precision fermentation. All the people that we've talked to here on the podcast, really, New York City is becoming that bioindustrial innovation hub. And we're very happy to be a part of that.
Yeah. And one of the things that we tell each other is if you're going to build a brand, there is no better place than New York City. So if you're going to build a biotech brand, this is a great place to be. You mentioned biopharma and our focus on more bioindustrial, but I just wanted to make a comment on a big piece of news that happened a couple of weeks ago, which is the approval of Casgevy, which is the first CRISPR-based drug. Meaning what they're going to do is they will go in and change your genetics, and it's going to be for sickle cell disease, which affects a fair number of people. What was interesting was I've already seen one influencer on Instagram asking if you'd be willing to have a doctor mess with your genetics. And I think it's the wrong kind of question because what it's doing is setting up fear-mongering for something that took a really long time to, number one, get approved, and number two, for a very serious disease. And yes, I would let a doctor mess with my genetics if it was something that was going to be life-threatening. How about you, Erum? Would you let a doctor mess with your genetics?
Well, first of all, I think we need to change the narrative. I mean, you said it and I kind of cringed. But first of all, you're obviously very knowledgeable when it comes to genetics and using biology or biotechnology for different types of therapies. So for having that knowledge, that reduces the fear. So education reduces fear. We know that. So you said, would you let a doctor change your genetics, mess with your genetics? That scares me, even though I understand what we're going at here. I think a better term would be, would you have a gene removed or change or whatever this mechanism is for Casgevy to treat sickle cell disease? Talk a bit more educationally about what is actually happening so people can understand that this is a low risk situation. To let a doctor mess with my genetics, what does that mean? Is there going to be side effects? If there's none, it's like, if you're asking me, would you let a doctor risk-free without any side effects using precision editing to change your genetics so you and your future generations will never have sickle cell disease? I'd be like, yeah, I mean, of course. The way people speak about things is important. And I think that influencer did a disservice to a lot of people.
Yeah, and just to put this into context, so sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia or sickle cell anemia, it causes incredible pain. And people with beta thalassemia often have to have blood transfusions. This is a very serious disease. And what this approval does is it opens the door for future applications of gene editing or CRISPR technologies to cure other genetic diseases. These are diseases that are passed down to you from your parents, and you're very likely to pass them down to your children, depending on who your mate is. The drug was first approved in the United Kingdom. It was tested. It's a one-time treatment. It's a product that's being developed by Vertex Pharmaceuticals in collaboration with CRISPR Therapeutics. Just to put it into even more context, they treated 45 participants in a trial. They followed 29 of those participants, and apparently 28 of the people were relieved of the debilitating episodes of pain for 1 year after treatment. So again, it's like, how do you frame this and how do you tell this story? The influencer that I'm citing just happened to mention this was approved, put it in the context of gene editing, and then ask the question, would you let a doctor mess with your genetics? No context. So you're absolutely right, Erum. It's like you need to have more context and you have to help people understand why this kind of treatment is fascinating and why it's really going to be the future for at least any genetic disease, especially those that are due to a single mutation in your DNA, can be now treated with gene editing tools like CRISPR. So it's a very exciting time to be alive.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of the show on Netflix, Natural Selection, which gave a overview of the activities that are happening in gene editing, whether it's human or animal. I thought that they did a good job talking about the risk, but they also interviewed a lot of scientists that were working on these types of therapies using CRISPR. And one perspective is like, it's going to happen no matter what, right? Like it's just
right.
For them, this is the clear-cut solution. So whether it happens with our generation, the next generation, or the next generation, because there's going to be people just afraid that are uneducated about what the actual technology is. People are going to die because the technology hasn't matured because of all the fear or just of all the misunderstanding, which is a shame. Do you want this today or do you want this 50 years from now? So that's something that we have to decide, and we have to allow the people that do understand how to create these types of therapeutics to do their job. And then we all need to do a better job of understanding. We're going to do a bit of that here at Grow Everything. We're not a biopharma podcast, but we are Grow Everything. We want people to grow and live long, happy lives. So stay tuned for that. But I'm excited to see the fact that there's approval now. Hopefully that opens the floodgates and we all understand that when we see someone that has sickle cell disease and then they're cured of that, that's proof in the pudding. And that's what we're going to have to point to. It's like, look, they're alive. They feel better. What else do you need to know?
You brought up something really interesting, which is what does the future look like, or what do we want the future to look like? And we're very lucky that we speak to a lot of companies using biotechnology and applying it to many different areas. In addition, we talk to a lot of investors who are investing in those companies because they want to make the future happen faster. I think that's a very exciting place to be. So this gives us a perfect opportunity to introduce our guest, Julie Wolf of 2048 VC. I've known Julie for probably 10 years at least. She worked a lot at GenSpace, which you mentioned earlier. She was a teacher there, and she also worked for the American Microbiology Society and did a podcast for them for many years. And then she left there and had started a startup and then also joined this fund, 2048 Ventures, which is placing bets on the future. So I think let's let Julie talk about herself and give her introduction and hear what Julie is doing now.
All right, Julie Wolf, welcome to the Grow Everything podcast. We're so happy to have you.
It is wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
You had said before we got on that this is the first time you've been on that side of the table. Maybe you can tell our audience why that is.
Certainly. So before I entered VC world, I worked in a communications capacity for a scientific society called the American Society for Microbiology. And while I was there, I had the absolute pleasure to host a podcast called Meet the Microbiologist, where I got to sit in the host seat where you two are sitting and ask questions of very interesting guests. And so it is my first time in this capacity being on the other side of the table. So I'm quite excited.
Well, I used to love listening to you. I mean, we've known each other for a long time, but I felt like I really got to know you a lot better as the host of Meet the Microbe. So welcome on board. Erum, why don't you kick off the questions today since I kind of kicked off the conversation?
Sure. Yeah. Happy to. So, Julie, we know that you have a background in microbiology, but we would like to go to early Julie and learn about what sparked your interest in biology and then biotechnology.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think my answer might be different than a lot of folks who are like, oh, I've loved science my entire life, because I do love science. I mean, I think everyone who knows me knows how much I like science, but I think I have a lot of interests. And so it wasn't very early in my life that I knew this would be my trajectory. I think it really started to click for me, to be honest, not until I was in college and I was thinking about what the future would look like. I actually entered college with an expectation that I would do anthropology. I'd gone on like some digs in the Southwest before that. It did not gel with that version of Julie in college. I took a class, I think it was Introduction to Biology, actually. I remember very well the lesson that had to do with basically turning the entire auditorium at the University of Michigan, where I was, into a giant chloroplast in order to kind of illustrate what happens during photosynthesis. And I started to think about the molecular ways that cells receive signals from the world. As I dove deeper and learned more about microbiology, I started to think about, I guess you could say, almost the communication side. So how do single-celled organisms receive signals from the outside world, send signals to the outside world, and then make a decision, quote unquote, as to what they will do? The idea that this could happen at the cellular level, when I think it's quite intuitive that this happens also at the organismal level, like you and me, was just so fascinating. And I wanted to go down that rabbit hole of how things happen in a almost biophysical sense, where two different proteins will interact. And then that determines cellular fate in a way that might change the cell's machinery to start a new metabolism, to induce motility, whatever that is. And I just found that to be very interesting. And that is truly like the origin story for Julie to be like, okay, I want to do molecular biology, molecular microbiology. And that's basically what I did up until the time I left academia.
I mean, you were in academia, you got your PhD. What did you do after you finished the PhD? What was the trajectory from Julie, the PhD, to Julie, the venture capitalist?
Sure. I will try to give you the not too long version, but I moved to, because it can be a long story, because I've had so many interesting chapters and been fortunate to have interesting chapters. I've spoken with folks around career paths for more than just VC world, for startup world, for science communications world. I did move to New York for my postdoc. I was continuing to look at medical microbiology, medical mycology, so fungi that make you sick, and looking at the molecular determinants of disease for Cryptococcus neoformans. Was in the lab with another guest who you've had on the pod, Sabriya Stooks, but that was in Arturo Casadoval's lab back when he was at Einstein. At that time, I remember when I first started my postdoc, someone was like, "Is this your first postdoc?" And I was like, "This is my only postdoc." Like, I am not here for the long haul to make it or break it in academia. And so I started looking at alternative careers. And I mean, alternative can be kind of incendiary. Some people are like, it's not alternative when 70% of the workforce actually leaves academia, as happens with PhDs. But at any rate, I was very active at a community biolab called GenSpace that you guys are also familiar with, and have also, I believe, featured here on the pod. I just recognized that communications was something that I gravitated toward naturally. I have decent writing skills for technical writing, and so I was exploring a number of different ways I would be able to use those. Ended up at the American Society for Microbiology in the communications department. For the audience members who aren't familiar, it's kind of like a professional society for different life science sectors. This one is for microbiologists. They have similar life science societies for immunology, for oncology, all types of different fields. This was really great because I was one of the few PhD staff members, even though many of the members of ASM are PhD scientists, the staff is expert in other things like communications, but also events, publications, policy, all of these other things that I was able to start to learn from my colleagues, and I really enjoyed that. So that was 2015 when I started that job. At the same time, this was a very busy time in my life. I also was teaching at GenSpace. I taught a monthly class that was Biohacker Bootcamp, which was basically molecular biology for the public, where people would get hands-on experience, isolate some DNA from their cheek cells, learn about their ancestry, make a genetically modified organism, and really, really enjoyed that experience as well. At the same time, also had a startup of my own with members from GenSpace who I had met that was called Brooklyn Bio. We were making a microbial strain for better bioproduction. And that's an area that I'm still quite interested in. So we can talk about what it means, what bioproduction means, and what kinds of things need to be made through bioproduction. And learned a lot about the startup experience at a very, very early stage. That didn't take off. Clearly, here I am, but certainly kind of understood what it means to put together a lab. How do you develop a project? How do you submit grants for that venture? At the same time, we were acting as a CRO, so understood quite a bit in terms of like, how do you project manage and get revenue in the door, et cetera. Finally, through all of those different activities, eventually moved into VC land through the accelerator space. So I did work with SOSV's IndieBio for a while. I started with the founding of the New York office in 2020. I was there for 3 different cohorts, really enjoyed that experience. Throughout my tenure at American Society for Microbiology, one thing I did want to highlight was like, we published a lot of data. There's 12 different journals, lots of different things that were being published. I remember thinking when I was looking at one of these things about microbial electricity, which is a very fascinating field, and you can talk about like the pili from Geobacter. I remember talking about this with you. I remember thinking, why isn't someone using this in something besides a research capacity? And thinking that this was an important thing to get into the world and not just as a really neat finding, but hey, there's really probably some very cool applications of this technology as well. So everything kind of came to a head in terms of working at IndieBio, learning a little more on the commercialization side of things, helping companies to find what that commercialization is. And through that, of course, expanding my own network, learning throughout this entire experience that I've been telling you about, of course. And then finally ending up speaking with Alex Iskold, who's the founder of 2048 Ventures. He was interested in expanding the bio practice. This is where he and I really got on, because this was, if you remember back in like 2021, it was like the heydays of crypto, and everyone was leaning into NFTs and blockchains where a lot of these early stage VCs were looking. And he was like, people are looking in the wrong direction. Bio is the future. And I was like, okay, I think I'm going to get on with this guy. They at 2048 had made some investments. I liked what they had been investing in, and I saw a potential synergy between our lines of thinking. So joined the firm in March of 2022. So I've been there about 1.5 years now, a little more than that, and have been expanding the bio practice. Really enjoying the ride, I would say.
Julie, you said we could talk about bioproduction. What is that and why does it matter?
Bioproduction is a pretty broad term. The way that I think about it are things that are made using biology. And one of the things I used to actually talk about at the class that I would teach, starting with having people define biotechnology. And what is that? And it's basically like using biological concepts or foundational principles and engineering those into something that has an application for human needs. So this can look like changing the way that a bacterial strain produces certain proteins so that they're decorated with the right sugars, so that it can create an antigen that you can use in a vaccine. Now, there's many steps in there that could be engineered to either increase the yield, increase the type of immune response that you want, and decrease the type that you don't want, change the way that the bacterium is eating different sugar sources in order to perhaps make that more cost effective for the end manufacturer, being able to grow them at 10,000 or 100,000 liter scale, in addition to, of course, the 1 liter or smaller types of cultures that people might do in the initial R&D. So all of those things encompass bioproduction for me, things that are made by biology, engineered to be more efficient by and for humans.
So you're looking at all areas of biotechnology. You mentioned that you had a startup. You mentioned that you were also very interested in microbial electricity. So yeah, I'm really curious to know, what type of biotechnology companies are you seeing? Which ones are you interested in? And which ones are missing? Just kind of the landscape from your perspective.
I think it's important to keep in mind, like 2048 Ventures had a thesis when I joined it as well. And so the mandate for the fund, which is, of course, what is sold to the LPs and what we are going to invest in, is infrastructure, platform, and API companies. And I love infrastructure. For me, that's how you really build up a sector. How do you build bioproduction capacity? You have to think about what are the nuts and bolts, or the picks and shovels, as people like to call it, that are necessary in order to be able to facilitate scaling up quickly, to be able to facilitate using different feedstocks. And that can be hardware, like different types of bioreactors. That can be different types of strains, as I mentioned. That can be a computational layer that is kind of the IoT of fermentation so that you're better able to detect, let's say, contamination, which is a huge issue in those large reactors. I'm getting a little away from your question, but I'm just saying in terms of the fund was very infrastructure focused. So now I continue to think about infrastructure, and I think about that in a number of different ways. So I would say one area that we focus on is the omics space. So that's a place where you can build up large data sets. These can be either public data sets, but often, have some sort of proprietary addition to them, something that perhaps is being generated through high throughput automation within the lab, and then layering on AI, ML capabilities, the computational capabilities to sift through the biological haystack to find that needle that might be your biomarker. Then you could go forward with to use for a diagnostic, could use for clinical trial selections, could use as a drug target. There's lots of different things that you can use that for, but it all starts with the data, which comes from, of course, the molecular side, but also imaging side. You can plug in patient records so you get even more holistic and more longitudinal type of patient profile as well. So that's one area. Synthetic biology is something else that we think about, and that can look very similar to bioproduction. That's kind of where the synbio stuff comes into play. I think that there are a lot of different opportunities also within kind of the human health space. If you think about cell and gene therapies as ultimately things that are designed using biology or using biological compounds, and you want to get these nucleotides or you want to get these proteins into a certain structure or a certain order in order to, number one, make them scalable for manufacturing. Number two, make them targetable for whatever that particular disease indication is. I also consider that under the larger synbio hat, just in terms of, again, engineering biology. Those are two large, broad areas that I think we can dive into.
And when you're looking at these companies, what are the key criteria that 2048 is looking for in terms of technology, founding team?
So there's a couple of different things that we look for. Again, because we're very early stage, we know that there's a lot of risk. I mean, in general, there's a lot that's yet to be proven in terms of being able to build out. Let's say you're making some kind of amazing new microbial strain, and you've been able to demonstrate that it can make one thing at one particular yield. But of course, as a venture capitalist, you're not interested in just one strain. You're interested in okay, we're going to be able to make many different things. And we're going to be able to add on different layers of complexity. So a couple of things around the tech. We want it to be novel. We want it to be both. This is going to be a little conflicting, but we want it to be both the dream, but also we want to see that there's a realistic stepwise manner, like this is possible, recently published, or have some evidence that there is a path to validation that this is going to be the best tech for this solution. Very important is the founder as well, because a lot of these very technical products require, I would say, almost interrogation of the market to find the best application. So let's say you have a magical strain that is going to be able to add these sugars to proteins. What do you use that for? What could you use that for? So the flip side of the technical coin is being able to basically call your way into the industry, or leverage your network if you are already in the industry, and make sure that you have very thoroughly looked at, is the best use case for this particular technology to make a therapeutic? Is it to make a vaccine? Is it to make a diagnostic? Are there cases in the ag space? Could we somehow tie this into something with pesticides, like make a biological pesticide? I'm just giving an example of one particular thing, but it could be many, many different things. And often technical founders will come without that really large lens of interrogation, and they will think they already know the answer. And the most important thing in terms of what we are looking to invest in is that they have spoken with the folks who have said, that's a terrible idea, or that's a great idea, or there is some sort of customer feedback here. And then finally, pulling those two together is the big vision. You want someone who is going to be driven to bring whatever this technology is to the bigger vision in terms of this is going to change the world in some hopefully positive way. That's why we all like biotech, but there needs to be substantial potential for change as well.
Can you give us an example of one of your portfolio companies, maybe that exemplifies all of those aspects? Which one's further along, to give us an example?
Happy to. I think probably the best company, based on what the examples that I've given so far, is Decoding Bio, and they're a company based out of the UK. They are productizing the CAR for CAR Ts. And so what does that mean? That means that they're able to help biotech and pharma companies find the correct CAR sequence to then put into T cells to create a novel CAR T therapy, which is a cellular therapy in which the T cells, often of a patient, but can be from another donor, are given basically the instructions on what they should be attacking immunologically within the patient, directed toward cancer in this case. The way that they're doing this is very clever. They have basically high throughput screening mechanism, and then they layer on the compute, as I said at the beginning. So they have kind of that lens of like, we're going to leverage data in order to pattern match the correct sequence for whatever the customer is looking for here. Now, importantly, the founder, in fact, both founders of this company have what we call really great founder market fit, meaning that they were working in the CAR T space. They understood how it worked already and kind of the bottleneck that companies were experiencing when they were selecting those sequences by which they would move forward. Simon Borshing, who's the founder, said, this can be better. We can do this better right now. I don't want to say they were throwing arrows at the dartboard in order to select them, but it was a lot less systematic. It was a lot less high throughput. So he understood the greatest possibility for getting these to market, number one, quickly, and number two, with higher probability of clinical success. Those are the two main value props here, is by looking at lots of sequences rather than designing 100, which sounds like a lot, but ultimately is not that many.
So our listeners are clear, those who don't know what CAR T therapy is. Basically, it's a form of cancer therapy. It's actually considered to be one of the revolutions in cancer therapy, where they will take T cells from your own blood. So T cells are immune system cells that fight infection. They pull them from your blood. They reprogram them so that they include these sequences that Julie is talking about, so that they attack very specific cancer cells. Then those CAR T, the modified T cells, are grown in a lab and then re-injected into the patient to attack the cancer cells. I'm pretty sure I got most of that right. If I didn't, Julie, correct me, or we can have a listener correct me.
No, that's more or less in a nutshell. So those are autologous. Those are patient-derived. There are also some off-the-shelf T cells that people are trying to do without having to take them from the patient. I think that those have yet to be approved, last I checked.
There's so many challenges when it comes to these new cancer therapeutics. We don't really talk that much about therapeutics on Grow Everything, but we should more. But there's a lot of challenges with taking cells from a patient, modifying them, growing them. There's supply chain issues, there's transportation issues. So there's a lot of things involved in this kind of therapy, but it has been revolutionary. And it is one of the ways that using the patient's own immune system is really changing the way that we treat cancer.
Yeah, entirely.
Mm-hmm. So Decoding Bio is a great example. It's a biopharma or therapeutic company that you guys invested in. Do you have any non-biopharma biotech companies that you guys invested in?
So yes, we do invest in all different types of companies. Another company that I think I can bring up is Aclid, which is a computational company, but solving a big problem in terms of the biosecurity space. And this is, I think, really important, especially as we consider how AI, how quickly it has grown in its applications. I mean, outside of bio as well, but within bio and the ability to design certain types of sequences. So what Aclid is doing is basically a software layer that can layer on top of any type of DNA synthesis, also sequencing, but we'll talk about synthesis first, provider, to look at what is being ordered by the customer. Are these sequences the right sequences, and do they contain anything that the order should not contain? Largely, is this going to be belonging to a bacterium that could have some sort of toxic effect? Is there a toxin in this sequence? And that could be, of course, purposeful, but can also be accidental just based on the way that DNA sequences can be programmed. There are other kind of benefits that come along with this, but that is the prime value prop that I think comes with the synthesis providers for now. With additional kind of know your customer, like background checks, because there's all this paperwork that customers have to fill out to make sure that if they are ordering a microbe or something that is a certain pathogen, there's lots of labs that have permissions and certain kinds of paperwork in academia and industry. And, you know, it kind of takes the pain of having that ping, 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 ping of emails between the customer service rep and the customer. Additionally, you can also use this, as you could imagine, if it's software for DNA screening for sequencing purposes. And there's an added layer of being able to look for either anything that you want or more targeted. You could imagine using this, for example, you are looking for certain pathogens within wastewater or public sector or something like that.
this kind of security layer, again, just to kind of add more color to the need for something like this, is especially important as DNA synthesis becomes more widespread. I mean, that is part of growing the bioeconomy is number one, access to sequencing and being able to read DNA. But then the second part of it is being able to write DNA. And there are desktop DNA synthesizers that are available, and they are becoming smaller and more widespread. So you want to have a security layer built into it so that people can't be printing things that are dangerous. So we know the ACLED story very well.
Yeah, and I know that this is kind of a nascent technology, this DNA synthesis, but putting in those guardrails in the early stages and helping to get the industry's buy-in as well, I think is really important to mention here. You or your listeners may have seen that the White House just made an announcement around AI going forward, and this is exactly the type of guardrails that they're talking about in terms of people who are, let's say, designing DNA using one of these now readily available type of AI-based technologies or AI-based kind of services. Well, this is something that you can layer on top of that to make sure that the AI has gotten it right. Now, you also, of course, double checks humans, but just in case anything slips through the cracks, I think that this is really important. And as you mentioned, Karl, as the decentralization of some of these synthesis technologies kicks off.
Yeah. Well, since you're an investor, I know you probably see hundreds, maybe thousands of companies per month. What are some interesting applications of AI in biology that has come across your desk, and like how is it being used?
Oh, this is an excellent question because everyone's like, oh, what is your AI strategy? What is your AI strategy within the investor community? And here's the thing, hopefully also within the founder community, because like lots of different technologies, AI is a tool. We expect almost at this point that almost every company that we see is going to be using this in some capacity, using either novel models that will help them to sift through some of the data that they are collecting or that they have access to. In coding bio, for example, I mentioned that they can sift through those large data sets. And that's in part because they're building the models that will better predict which of those CAR sequences. Same thing with Kevin Flangholz, who's CEO of ACLED. It is AI-based. That is one of the reasons why they are able to sift through large amounts of DNA so quickly, is because they have the correct algorithms as the basis and the foundation of the company that will allow them to more quickly triage what is not necessarily a dangerous sequence, and then they can flag the ones that are true hit. Applications outside of that, as I said, almost everything that we see has an application. I don't really want to get into Gen AI for protein, but yeah, you can see it everywhere.
Yeah, I guess it was just like, what is something that stood out? And they're like, wow, that's genius. Or like, I never thought about that using AI in that capacity for biology. Because I know that I've seen a lot of that generated AI protein modeling or creation. But
yeah, that's a little bit outside of where we're looking. But I will say that the thing that blew my mind, again, as someone who is more or less like a pipetter for most of her academic career, is the ability to use computer vision and these models to predict things out of, let's say, pathological slides or pathology slides, something that's H&E stained for histopath, and be able to diagnose actual biomarkers using that, be able to know where there are certain protein concentrations, even if there's no stain for them, which continues to blow my mind that we have enough data. Isn't that crazy? The ability to make predictions based on cell morphology is really, really increasing. There's a number of companies that are working in this space, histopathology, microscopy, all types of different applications you could imagine for like drug discovery to diagnostics. But the thought that we might be able to start using some of these large data sets, all of it's based on actual data, has to be validated in some way. But then going forward, that we would be able to skip the staining step or like even skip the treatment step and be able to say, okay, well, this protein is present in this area of the cell simply by morphology continues to be kind of mind-blowing to me.
I mean, what about you, Julie, as an investor in biotech? What's your AI use like?
Oh, what's my AI use? A little bit. I use ChatGPT and other types. I mean, I use some of these to like give me summaries of scientific papers, things that will allow us to more quickly get to a review and like give us the TLDR without having to like read every single figure legend.
Yeah.
So yeah, we certainly use a lot of productivity tools as well.
yeah, that's awesome. So again, like you have this very unique position of being able to meet all of these biotech startups. What are some common reasons for you not to invest in a startup? What are some things that you see that you're like, oh, I really wish that these startups would get this right? Because maybe we would invest in them, but they're missing this or they're doing this.
It happens all the time. Oh, let me tell you. Because yes, as a technologist at heart, I want to see these things come to the future. I want to see a future built where we are reading and writing genomes and like able to do this so easily that we can like program novel metabolisms. I think It's important for technical founders to remember that they're building a business. And that can be really hard to remember. Even in the first meeting with them, I want to know surface level about how the technology works. But if that meeting goes well, have additional opportunities to dive in where we can really understand how the technology works. One of the things I want to see is that they have done some of this commercial interrogation of the technology as well. Who is the user? Who wants to buy this right now versus who wants to buy it once the technology is more mature? What steps are they taking to understand what the sales process looks like? I know that all that stuff sounds really boring compared to the amazing technology things, that applications and innovations that are really what drive the industry. But if you aren't thinking about all of these other business aspects, which is fine, by the way, bring on board a friend who can or who wants to do that stuff. Bring someone on who loves spreadsheets and wants to go through the customer funnel every morning. I just can't overemphasize that you need to be thinking about the commercial aspects of a large business. And one thing to highlight is there's lots of different ways to commercialize technology. I'm talking about like venture scale. We need to see a path to like 100 million in revenue. What does that look like? Much different than if you get a loan or, even work with friends and family rounds. But in this case, this is why we're interrogating the business as much as we are the technology.
Yeah, I heard someone say recently that you can always tell a first-time founder because they tend to focus on the product or the tech, and maybe they focus on a little bit of the benefits of the product or the tech, but the more seasoned founder is always going to be more focused on the business side of it.
But you know who makes great founders? Product managers. Because they are not so in the weeds that they are only lost in the details. They can see the higher level vision and they can also see above them as well. You're correct. Sometimes technologists can be a little bit product focused. It's great to be product focused. It's just good to get your head above the clouds once in a while so you can get that larger vision.
Yeah, I love that you said that because we meet all sorts of founders. You're mentioning technical founders, but have you seen some non-technical founders come through or technical founders that also take the CEO role, but then figure that maybe they don't have the skill sets to necessarily do the business aspects and then hire someone on? Like what kind of dynamics have you seen change between founders as they pitch you or as you see them grow?
Well, I think companies have many chapters. As I talked about my own life, I think companies also have many chapters. And sometimes the best person to get started in that CEO position is the inventor of the technology because they see the promise. Sometimes they are good to take that all the way and go all the way to IPO. We can mention several examples of what that has looked like. But sometimes it's good to bring someone on who has a more commercial background and perhaps a network for whatever that customer may look like as the company grows. And sometimes you can do that right away. I don't think that there's one right answer. I will say that a CEO/CSO, someone who's wearing both hats, can start to become a bottleneck as the company grows because the company needs to be fundraised for. It needs sales done. It needs the product to continue to be iterated on. And if one person is doing all three of these things, it's just too many hats to wear. There's just not enough hours in the day, to be quite frank. It is, again, with exceptions, possible, but by and large, it is good for someone who's a technical founder to understand where their sweet spot is. And as the company grows, to think about which role they truly want. That CEO role that takes them further away from the tech or the science, or that CSO/CTO role where they get to stay very close to what it is that they're building and still have that leadership position.
Being someone who sees the whole landscape, what do you see as missing? If you can find a startup or build a startup or find this one thing, what startup would it be? Like, what do you wish actually manifested?
We've been thinking about this a lot internally for some of these sectors where we see lots of different opportunities. And let me explain. So, for example, I see a lot of companies that are taking a diagnostic test to the clinic, and they may have certain data partnerships or like maybe they validated their test to a certain extent, but they basically want to develop the test and then commercialize that. I see a lot of companies that are creating something using a biological process in this bioproduction space that want to do this in a more sustainable way. And that can be enzymatically, that can be using microbes, that can be using mammalian cells. But a lot of them are what we call vertically integrated, meaning they're going to create the product, they're going to go through all of the approval or scale up processes, manufacturing, and then they're going to take that to market. And that's a great way to have a business. Some of the things that are missing are exactly what I talked about at the beginning here, the infrastructure companies for these. What are the companies that help all diagnostic companies move faster because there are bottlenecks. There are bottlenecks around patient acquisition, patient data acquisition. Even getting different data subsets and making them talk to one another can be a little bit of a challenge. What about the regulatory paperwork? Is there an opportunity in terms of how some of these are going to be regulated? Will companies either that are coming up the pipeline or already developing a test need help in terms of getting through some of these regulatory challenges and making sure all their paperwork is up to speed? So that's one flavor when I say things that are missing. But similarly, around the manufacturing side that I mentioned, there are a lot of folks that are taking these to market. Well, maybe we need a marketplace for them, or maybe we need something that is going to, again, like a different type of bioreactor that would be better gauged for that scale up. Maybe it is something around the sensor space, as I mentioned. So again, when I think about these industries writ large, I think about why are they not moving faster? Why are the companies that are within these spaces not moving faster? Where are those bottlenecks? Because I think that there are opportunities now that these are fairly mature sectors to build the types of technologies, companies that would help these companies to move faster.
That's such a good point. I think it's one of those things where people end up with an idea or a company idea or a technology, and they know that there's a market out there, but what are the things that can help you accelerate your path? And a lot of those technologies or those marketplaces, as you say, are missing. So I think that's a fantastic answer.
We have a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast, people that are aspiring to be entrepreneurs or learning more about biotechnology as a solution, because a lot of entrepreneurs are solution oriented. They see a problem, they're looking for a solution. So what kind of advice would you give aspiring entrepreneurs as they enter the biotech space, or individuals that are interested in becoming entrepreneurs or investors in the biotech industry?
I get asked the former more frequently, but let me answer first the entrepreneur part, and then I'll talk about the investor part. I think entrepreneurs should broaden their network as much as they can, especially if you're early career. And even if you're not, if you're mid-career, talk to folks, see where their pain points are. You don't frame it like, hey, what's your pain point? You have to think about the questions very carefully that you ask that will give you valuable answers, but find out what their day-to-day is like. Where do they wish they could gain time? Where do they find themselves having to repeat steps or not being efficient in terms of the processes that they're running? And that could be at the scientific level, or it kind of depends on who you're talking to. But in general, talk to people and talk to other founders. Talk to other founders as you build your company. Where have they had challenges? How can their experience help to inform yours as you're going through the world? I often have said, I think that founders learn the most from other founders, more so than investors, because other founders are in the same ecosystem at this same moment. Even investors who previously had very successful startups were doing that under a different time. So talk to other founders, build your network, build your community, and always remember that your reputation is really important. So do the things that you say you're going to do. Now, to address the last question, I get a lot of folks who ask me about going into the VC world as well. Honestly, my first answer is a little glib, but it's like start a company, because then you will learn both the empathy that it takes in order to back some of these founders, but also you will broaden your investor network. And then when you're ready to go to the other side of the table, you'll already have a pretty large network of folks who like to work with you. It's not quite that easy, but I think getting some experience before going directly into investing is very helpful by and large. For folks who are coming directly out of academia, you can do it and people do it, but it helps to understand, again, how the world works and what it's like to do drug development. What is that process like? What is it like to have to scale fermentation? What is it like to have to build hardware or find a manufacturing facility? All of these things are going to be helpful in terms of being able to help your portfolio companies when you eventually become an investor.
That's great. I'm curious what you think, what does biotech look like in 3, 5, 10 years? And specifically, what does it look like in New York City?
Oh, specifically New York City. I didn't think about that question. Well, let me first say, I think that we're certainly moving at a very rapid clip. The way that we are converging both the tech advancements of the last couple of decades with now the biotech and the molecular advancements is just crazy. It's an amazing time. It's an amazing time to be engaged with the world. I think we're moving toward broadly more personalized medicine, more personalized diagnostics, more personalized care, and that can look like a variety of things. Ideally, we are also moving toward more sustainable types of manufacturing for the products that we use in our day-to-day life. And to be honest, I know that often we will focus on industrial chemicals and ingredients with that, but that goes for drugs too, because there are certain types of chemical processes that are being actively investigated by some of these pharma companies to be made greener. I find that to be quite interesting as well. Those are the two large trends that I think are going to be dictating the next 10 years. In New York, we just had the Chan Zuckerberg announcement of the new biohub. So I think what that will do is continue to accelerate the growth of biotech and the entrepreneurial spirit, if that makes sense, within New York City. And I can explain that because I've been living in New York since 2010. So I have certainly the years under my belt of having been in this city and seen what aspiring early career scientists want to do with their lives and how that has changed. When I first moved to New York, things were a little less entrepreneurial. People didn't think to necessarily commercialize their technology or to go be a first hire, be the first scientist at a startup and learn like how that is. And I think that that is changing quite quickly. And that's accelerated by large institutions like the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub, but also by grassroots organizations like Nucleate. It would be great to have on here, by the way, because they are the young, energetic scientists who are running this are so amazing and very inspirational. It's the kind of like organization I would have loved when I was still in academia. So I think across all parts of the world and all across the US, but in particular, the New York chapter is very strong. I think that will continue to amplify startups that are coming out of many really well-regarded institutions in the New York area.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You're absolutely right. We should have someone from Nucleate on. The only challenge with Nucleate is the head person changes every year. But
I know, they just hired their first full-time person.
Oh, good.
And she's based in New York.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So
okay.
if you're interested, I can connect you guys.
Yeah, we would love that. See this announcement yesterday for Future House.
I did not.
I think it's pretty based in SF, but they've got a 10-year mission to build a semi-autonomous AIs for science research. And the idea is to accelerate the pace of discovery. It got a lot of traction, at least on Twitter. A lot of people were tweeting about it. It sounds like a really great team of people, and it sounds like a great mission. Cool. Yeah, very cool. Julie, was there anything that we didn't cover in this conversation before we say goodbye?
I think we're good.
Thanks so much, Julie. It's been a pleasure. I mean, you are part of what we call our Biotech Brooklyn Mafia. So we'll definitely have you on again and see how things are developing with the portfolio companies, especially talking about what's going on in the industry. It's been a real treat.
Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. All right, guys.
All right, see ya. Bye. So, Karl, what did you think of the interview?
Julie is the greatest. I feel so lucky to have her in our community and to have her in our lives. It's clear she's living her best life. It's really a lot of fun to run into her, to chat, and to have her on this podcast. I feel like we don't see each other often enough. She's gotten incredibly busy, but she's just so great. What did you think?
Yeah, she has a wealth of knowledge. I really enjoy speaking with her. The fact that she has this deep science background and now she's in the investment world, really looking at these opportunities from a business standpoint. She is one of a kind. For us, we do see people that straddle both worlds. So we're lucky that Julie's a part of a community and can wear the scientific hat and wear the business hat and the funding hat. So I love that about her. In the episode, we talked a bit about some of the companies that 2048 invested in. And one of those companies is Aclid, which we know very well. We worked with them for a little bit. Aclid is so interesting. I mean, she talked about how they create the security layer for DNA synthesis. And it's so important for technology companies or industries to start thinking about safeguards and guardrails. The fact that Aclid's doing this, being able to provide this service to all these biotech companies, to give not only the government, but us as civil society some reassurance that biotech will not go awry and not be used with some malfeasance, but with true helpful applications, whether it's for our health, whether it's to help with creating sustainable products. So I thought that was really interesting that she and the 2048 community made the investment in Aclid and that there's a lot of support for that type of company. The Bio Conference in Boston earlier this year was kicked off by the Department of Defense. Hopefully, a lot of biotech companies use Aclid and nothing falls through the cracks. But unfortunately, that won't be the case. And we are at risk of something happening, whether it's accidental, something evolutionary. But how do you create, let's say we had this pandemic? I mean, that's not even a hypothetical. It happened. So how do we create a vaccine very quickly? How do we get ahead of any type of biological weapon that affects us here in the US? I mean, every country should be paying attention to this, but how do we stop it from harming us? How do we defend ourselves against any type of bad biology that comes our way? It's really interesting to see how the Department of Defense is now participating more heavily in the biotechnology industry.
Yeah, well, they've always been a big player in the bioeconomy executive order of 2022. They were named at the top of it. I think pretty early on in terms of like being ahead of helping to enable biomanufacturing infrastructure.
Julie and her team are looking at this in terms of the future, right? Of course, all investors are, and there's a lot of technology coming online. What I really appreciated what Julie did in this episode is that she gave great advice to entrepreneurs. And when we're talking about biotechnology or any type of technology, we've oftentimes seen founders, and I have done this myself, is where we just focus on the technology because it's so novel, it's so interesting to you. You have a pitch, you have a gut feeling that it's a great technology and it's going to solve problems, but you're not necessarily thinking of the customer, who that is, how much they'll pay you. And you might think about it, but not as much as, let's say, you should. So when we asked Julie about like what advice that she would give to entrepreneurs, she was like, look at the business. Think about the business of your technology, not just about how novel and cool it is, but who's going to pay you for that technology? And actually, how are you going to productize it? Because yes, there's what's going on in the back end, but how are people or your customers going to interact with it? How much time are they going to spend on it? How big is that market? How many people will pay you for that product that is built on top of your technology? And in the end, this is what we do at Messaging Lab, but part of what we do is we don't just theorize, we actually go and speak to those people. And those people I'm talking about customers. We really encourage our clients to go and speak to the customers, even if they don't really have a product yet, but just talk to them. It's okay. Even if they say, sorry, I'm too busy, at least you got on their radar. So do actual customer discovery. And I think that Julie made a great point when she brought that as one of the top pieces of advice to provide.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you and I have been around entrepreneurs for a long time, and you would think that they would know better. There's always new people starting companies, and this point of customer discovery, which is something we do all the time, I think for new founders, new entrepreneurs, PhDs that have never started a business before, it is one of the most important things. The technology is almost secondary to finding the customer. The technology is almost just the enabler for the customer. If that's something you ever want to talk about, listener, to grow everything, drop us an email or give us a call. It's something we live and breathe every day. Is there anything else, Erum, or is that the pod?
That's the pod. What a great conversation. I always love speaking with investors because they have such a high level perspective since they see so many companies. And Julie is one of the best.
All right. Well, let's close it out and we will catch you on the next pod.